When it comes to Red and Black, historically the biggest issue that I've had with it is the lack of novel build paths. And sure, you have Chaos, Madness, Discard, and more recently Exile and Treasure themes, but I've always really bounced off of RAKDOS colors. But recently I've been challenging myself in my videos and my own personal decks to go back and make something interesting under the RAKDOS color banner. And with their upcoming release of Ravnica Remastered, I thought it would be interesting to go back and revisit an old classic, RAKDOS, Lord of Riots. This commander really embodies a lot of personal deck building decisions that I tend to dislike. First and foremost, he's screaming for us to play colorless big beaters like the Eldrazi, and if you know anything about the Eldrazi, they tend to be very limited in the selection that we have available to us, and therefore the build paths tend to be very samey-same. So for instance, when you're building an Atla Palani deck, strictly with Eldrazi, let's say, it tends to be a very similar type of experience when you're playing something completely different like a RAKDOS Lord of Riots. And therefore, I made the executive decision to not include any of these. And really, that's because I'd rather show up at my local game store covered in peanut butter than make another deck dedicated simply to the Eldrazi Titans. There you go. Second, and you might have to understand horoscopes to get this one, RAKDOS is the Cancer to my Capricorn. That's right, I have a birthday coming up. And for those of you less attuned to the horoscope world, RAKDOS is oil in my water. I tend to be a Simic or an Izzet player through and through, and the playstyle that RAKDOS affords me is generally not that enjoyable. So I'm going to be making some specific deck building decisions to help moderate this. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that I have a classic build for a classic commander, which means in this case, we're going to focus in on a demon tribal strategy while at the same time throwing in the old classic RAKDOS staples that it became known for. We're going to still have the power, we're going to still have the spice that RAKDOS can afford us. Let me just say, I had to really resist the urge to cut some of these demons. There are a lot of cards like Bloodgift Demon that simply make me yawn because of the unimpressive effect. I figured that there had to be better includes out there, so I scoured the MTG databases, but to no avail. Unfortunately, if we want to harness the full utility of our commander, we're going to need more cards like this in the 99, and in a rather opposite direction, cards like Villas, which are insanely good, have the issue of being very expensive in the pips department. This isn't just a problem with the Blood Broker, however, just look at the number of included demons with at least 2 colored pips, but many of them have 3, which is insanely high for my average decks. And believe me, I looked to cut these, I wanted to cast stuff for close to free, and eating up our colored mana base just isn't something I was going for. The unfortunate thing is we're stuck with a certain number of demons, and many fall into this category of being quite good, but extremely expensive to cast pip-wise. This is a roundabout way of me saying we're stuck with what we have. Not the end of the world, but it does hurt my soul that I can't optimize this deck strictly with demons to cast everything for free. But with those complaints out of the way, we do have some impressive specimens in this deck, many of which have actually come out over the last couple of years. RAKDOS Lord of Riots has really been able to beef up his deck list with some of these new includes and impressive specimens. Just to list a few, Archfiend of Despair, which admittedly is older, but is quite underpriced right now due to a recent reprint. We also have Balor that came out in the last couple of years, Bloodthirster, Herald of Slaanesh, the Balrog of Moria, and even Razaketh, which again is not necessarily new, but had a reprint and the price has dropped substantially. You should definitely look to pick up a couple of these guys before it shoots back up in price. And this is just one of those builds, as you can see, where my inner Timmy just starts to yell at me to shut up and just include all of the big, stupid demons. But because we are focusing on just the big, stupid demons, we have to focus on the how of cost reduction and not the what we are going to get as a result of our cost reduction. Classically, RAKDOS has used pingers like a Goblin Spewer or a Thermal Alchemist to burn the table for 3 damage on each activation, and also meet the prerequisite to cast him in the first place. Don't forget about that. And I do like this style because it affords us a more reliable gameplay experience, which is something that I always go for. But we have had newer sets come out and newer cards that would take the place of these, as I tend to be a bit more efficient. And the first is Creeping Bloodsucker, which is admittedly not a demon, but this 2-mana black creature drains the table at our upkeep, and the healing that this offers is actually something that tends to come in handy. And this card is not really that much of a threat, so even though it's not a on-demand activation like the others, I think our opponents are still unlikely to remove this before we get a chance to use it with our RAKDOS. And also in the Wilds of Eldraine set, we got Unruly Catapult, which untaps with instants and sorceries being cast. And this isn't super reliable in this deck, we don't have a ton of those, but I do think it's better than some of the older cards that were printed, so we're going to swap that one in. And finally, a noteworthy include in this same sort of category is Heartless Hidetsugu, which drains half of our opponent's life totals. And this card combos with Archfiend of Despair, which means our opponents lose the game at our end step. And that's pretty brutal, but also by itself, it functions similarly to the above cards and will basically make our demons free to cast or just the pips to cast them. But with the last card mentioned, it brings up an interesting point. Why did I not include a Wound Reflection or a Havoc Festival? Well, simply put, the deck is already extremely expensive, so having more 6-mana cards, especially enchantments that won't be cost reduced, didn't really seem to make any sense. And not only that, Havoc Festival triggers on the active player's upkeep, which means that we won't get to take advantage of the cost reduction from our commander. But I can hear you saying already, the reason that those cards are in there is not for the cost reduction, it's to combo with the Wound Reflection or an Archfiend of Despair. Yeah, I mean, that's also a problem. I mean, if we're running a card that's just going to piss everybody else off and also is an extremely expensive combo piece in the first place, doesn't that just seem like a bad idea or just a recipe for you to miss with this deck? Instead, why not just run more enablers for symmetrical damage or more ramp or really anything else just to forward your game plan more than these cards will? I think that these are some of the biggest mistakes I see included left and right because they sound great on paper, but at the end of the day, I do not think that they're going to give you the value or the bang for your buck that you're really looking for. And let's build off of this. So when I was building the deck, I made sure that 90% or more of our demons had a colorless mana requirement of 6 or less. And why did I do this? Well, look at our commander stat line. Now look at the keywords. Now look at the stat line. Now look at the keywords. Don't forget that our commander is a 6/6 flyer. We only need one open opponent to crack in for 6 damage to get the cost reduction on almost all of our demons in my build of the deck. This also means that haste enabling, or at least some type of protection, is important in this case to allow our commander to stick around on the battlefield or swing in right away to get the cost reduction. That's why I've included cards like Lightning Greaves, Fervor, and also Rising of the Day. And you could go even crazier with haste enabling to take advantage of plopping down multiple big demons per turn, but I think it's unnecessary. It's pretty obvious where our win con lies. Our creatures simply need to attack and attack again for us to get the win, but I wanted to mention a few key cards that I think really help elevate our board position to set us up for this scenario. Now, I love Sunbird's Invocation. Even if we have an 8-mana creature that we're casting for 2 mana due to the cost reduction, the mana value of the spell is still 8. Meaning that we get to reveal off the top until we hit something for 8 or less to cast for free. I used this card in one of my very first decks, Svella Ice Shaper, and it did some serious work. In this deck, it's plain ridiculous. Give it a try. Next is Liliana's Contract, and this is in here for obvious reasons, but I'm sure you're wondering why I include this card when I have specifically stated that I hate cards that say you win the game. Well, it's because this one is actually really difficult to pull off. There is no instant speed shenanigans here. Simply have 4 demons on the board for a full turn rotation and hope to God that they don't get removed. I think it just adds a fun, we have to stop him before the nuclear missiles get launched scenario to the game, whereas cards like Revel in Riches are simply too easy and non-interactive to exist in my tables. And finally, I wanted to highlight a suite of mass reanimation spells which I think have the chance to blow the game to pieces. Our opponents will happily want to remove all of our creatures, but if we can then cast a single-sided Repopulate on our board, especially with some type of haste enabler present, it's a clean sweep. Now, an issue that I haven't yet discussed is the ramp package, and admittedly this one is a bit difficult to crack without going full CEDH, and we certainly have some 3-mana ramp sources in the deck that are a little bit clunky, including Skyclave Relic and Relic of Legends. Let's start with Relic of Legends, which there are about 10 total legendaries in the deck to take advantage of this card to tap for our mana-hungry requirements, but at the end of the day, it is ultimately a 3-mana make 1 mana of any color rock. And Skyclave Relic is not my preferred, but at the end of the day, we can cast it for 3 mana early on in order to get out our commander, or later in the game when we have excess mana left over in order to meet our mana pip requirements. And in this deck, I think that that is extremely important. And on the topic of ramp, I did include a Cabal Coffers and an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth in the stock version of this deck. And that's because this is ultimately just another form of ramp, just in the form of lands only. And since we've included these, I made sure to also include an expedition map to tutor one of them out early. An early Urborg, for instance, will help mana fix us, and then later, hopefully we can hit the combo to accelerate out for a smoother gameplay experience. The last issue that I wanted to address was the lack of the pump effects such as a Vanquisher's Banner or a Door of Destinies. The main consideration to run cards like these are when we have a wide board that's typically very low on stat lines. For instance, it's a bunch of 1/1 elves that need to be pumped up in order for us to win the game. But we're going to have maybe 2 to 5 huge demons on our side of the board, and I don't think we necessarily need the pump effect that these types of cards offer, even though I see them crop up in a ton of decks on EDH Rec. Now, the deck space was already extremely tight, and including these would have been nice, but they're absolutely not necessary. And I think that a majority of the time we're not going to need them, and I think when you cut them and include more synergistic pieces in your deck, you'll notice an improvement in the overall performance. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're looking at deck consistency, we really should be looking to trim cards like this that don't necessarily do anything for our overall game plan. Sure, 100 damage is nice, but 40 damage will suffice. That's all you need. Buyer beware, this is not going to win any CDH tournaments anytime soon, but if you do have a slower pod or a slower group, then I think that this could be a very good option for you. The deck is slower in the sense that it's going to take multiple turns for us to get out our commander, and don't forget that we can't even cast our commander unless we've dealt damage. Don't forget that little tidbit. But also because our pip requirements are so immense in this deck, and just look at the average mana value of this deck, I think it's probably the highest that I've ever personally built. We're going to live and die by the cost reduction of our commander, and to be completely transparent, I think that there is an argument to actually include even more ramp in this deck, and to cut some of the more expensive demons that are heavier in pip requirements. But ultimately, I wanted to build a deck that mimicked a more classic demon tribal strategy, and you get what you get. Unfortunately, we're going to be stuck with some heavier pip requirements, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. If you want to play around with it, I think that the best and most important place to start would be cutting out some of those more heavy on the pip requirement demons for more ramp. But don't get me wrong, if we let our big boy Rakdos untap, our opponents are going to have a really bad time. And I think that this deck in particular has a chance to close the game out in essentially one turn once we hit our cost reduction off of Rakdos. But be mindful, it's going to take a while to get there. Now, if you want a more higher powered build, then just cut the chaff, cut out all the demons, and then just run the colorless spells like the Eldrazi Titans, Wormcoil Engine, all that good stuff. Run the free spells and run more counter magic and insert basically every tutor that I have neglected to include in this deck. As I said at the beginning, that is not the style I was going for. And if you're interested in that style of deck, then this is probably not the right video for you. And if you're with me on this, if you're interested in more decks that aren't just the strict highest possible power builds, then like the video and stick around for more just like this one. As always, you can find this deck and my others linked down in the description below in my Architect profile. If you wanted to support what I'm doing on the channel, the best possible way by far is to subscribe. Your subscription goes a very long way to ensure the future health and performance of my channel. That also means you get notified first upon my new releases, and you get access to my custom deck list as soon as possible. Support my addiction so I can continue supporting your addiction. I've been Kyle, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.